In this demo, we'll see how to use these data binding options to enhance our web performance tests. In this example, we're going to continue using the MVC Music Store application that we used in the previous module. You can get this from mvcmusicstore.codeplex.com as shown here. Also, on the homepage for this site, it shows you what the administrator password is for the application. We're going to be using this for the data binding example that we're about to show. To begin, we want to make sure that our application is running. So we'll Control F5 to run the app, and you'll see that we have it running now on localhost 26641. So next we're going to add a new web performance test. So we'll right-click, Add Web Performance Test. This will start the recorder. We'll paste in the URL, and this will start our application. Now, in this demo, we want to test the login functionality for the music store. So to require the login, we simply need to click on the admin link. And then initially we're going to use a login that does not work. So we'll try something like guest. And as you can see, it does not work. That's it for this test, so we're going to stop the recording. Next, we're going to repeat the process by adding another web test, going to the same URL, repeating the login, but this time we're going to go ahead and use the administrator, and then password 123 exclamation, and that will allow us to log in correctly. And we'll finish that test. Now what we would like to test with these two tests are the scenarios where the user has a valid login and the scenario where the user does not. This can be an important scenario for us to test from a performance point of view because we want to make sure that the login functionality of our application performs in a satisfactory manner since it's one that might be used quite frequently depending on what kind of application we're writing. It's also worthwhile to make sure that we test it with a variety of different logins so that we know that our data source that's being exercised is not just hitting the same row over and over again. So in this case, we're going to add some data binding to these two tests to make sure that they do just that. To begin, we'll go to the failing web test, and at this point, we're going to go ahead and rename it to a bad login. We'll say failing login web test. And we'll name the other one successful login web test. And with our failing login, we're going to add some data source to it. And so we're going to call this bad users as the name and reference a CSV file. Now at this point, we don't have a CSV file, so we're going to stop right here and create that. And so I've already created a data folder to hold this. And I'm just going to add a new item. And we're just going to add a text file called bad users CSV. And then the first row of this text file is going to include the column names. And each additional row will be a row of data. So I've already created this, so I have a username and a password and a couple of logins that don't work. Now we'll jump back to our web test where we were going to look for bad users CSV file. And at this point we're going to open up that file that we just created. So I'll paste in the path and we can see this bad users file that we created, and here's our data, and we'll finish. Now we have our bad users data source here. Let's look at how we can add data binding to the actual data that's used in our application. First, let's go ahead and run it as it stands now. We've added the data source, but we haven't bound anything yet, so nothing's really changed. So you can see everything still runs as we would expect. And if we inspect the code here, we can see that in our request, in our post, you can see here, we were passing in guest and guest as our form post parameters, and everything worked as expected. So now in here, we're going to examine these form post parameters. These are recorded with the recorded value of guest, which you can see here in our properties dialog. The value is specified here, so you can see that the recorded value and the actual value don't have to match up. When you start that, they will, but you can adjust that. So from this dropdown, we're going to apply some data binding. You can see our data source is listed here, and we can choose the username field for the username, and then repeat this for the password field. We'll select password, and now we can run the test again. And so you can see in this case, if we examine the results, we passed in admin admin, which was the first row of our test. Now if we want to be able to run our web test so that it executes once per row in our data source, we can do that by changing our test settings file. So to do that, we'll just scroll up to our solution items, locate our local test settings file, and within this, click on the web test option, where you can see that we have some options for running each one a fixed run count of 1, which is the default, or we can choose to run our web tests once per data source row. So if we check that radio button and apply the change, and then we come back to our failing login test and run it again, you'll see now that we have 2 runs. We have run 1 and run 2. If we look at the first one's request, you'll see that it's admin admin. And if we scroll down and look at the second one and see its request, you'll see it's guest guest, which corresponds to the data in our CSV file. Now you'll also notice that those were sequential. That is specified when you click on the actual data source here. You can see that the access method is specified by default as sequential. We can set the access method here to random or to unique. Both of these settings only apply when we are running a load test, however. In the case of a web test, we will always just grab 1 row per iteration of the test, if that's how we set things in our test settings file here. Note also that if we do use a value of unique, when we run a load test, the load test will only run as long as it has unique data to pull. Once the data source has exhausted all of its unique rows, the load test will end. We'll keep our access method here at sequential. Next, we can add some good users. So we'll simply copy the CSV, rename it to good users, and edit its data to include the correct credential. And then add this to our successful web test, such that our form post is going to use that new data source. So we have our CSV file. We'll select the good users, and then we can data bind them here. With that, we should be able to run this test, and it should work as it did before. And we can see here in our request that we are passing in the values that are now coming from that CSV file. So let's look at next how we can use a different kind of data source. Instead of using a CSV, let's try an XML file. So we'll go back to our data. We'll add a new XML item. And we'll call this one good users as well. And for the XML data, we simply need to ensure that it's in the correct format, which I already have, so I'll just copy it in. You can structure your XML data so it has numerous different types of data or table records in it. You can only have one root node, so in this case I've named that test data, but under that you can have different data types specified by different elements. In this case, I have a user data type, which has a username and password. If I wanted to, I could add other data types, like an album, which maybe had a title, like so. And then when I go to add my data source, I can select which table I want to use based on these options. So if we jump back to our successful login web test and we add our good users XML data source, we can pick our file and view the different tables here. So you'll see the album data or the user data as shown. We want to pick this user here and choose the table. We want the user table. Finish. And now we can go in and select for our username. Instead of coming from the CSV file, we can choose our XML data source and choose his username here instead, and do the same for the password. With that, now we're using XML as our data source, and we can run our test and see that we still are passing in the correct values. Let's wrap up this demo by showing how we can bind to a SQL Server data source. In this case, I've gone ahead and created a localhost version of a database called MVC Music Store Test Data, and I've added the connection here. Now this is an empty database I just created, so we're going to go ahead and add a new table. And since this is just test data, I can be pretty simple with what I need here. I just need a username, it can be a varchar50, and a password can be the same. And I don't really care if they have nulls. Let's say no, and we'll save this. We'll call it users. And then we need a little bit of test data in there, so we'll go back to our Server Explorer and view the table data, and we'll add our administrator password 123 bang row. And now we've got our sample database with our test data, so we can close that. And it's time to add one more data source, and in this case we're going to choose database. We'll call it good users SQL. And we need to connect to that MVC Music Store test data source. And this will let us choose a table that we want to use, which is the users table. And we're done. So then at this point, if we want to add some data binding to that table, we can simply choose it just like we have before. And as you can see, we can bind now to a SQL data source. And at that point, we can run our test. And everything still works as before. You can see we're now pulling this data here from our SQL data source. Now there's pros and cons to each of these different data source choices. If you want to have a very portable data source that's very easy for you to edit without the need to use a SQL connection, then CSV and XML are probably your best choices. If you want, however, to have a larger data source, maybe that you're connecting and sharing among a number of different test instances, then at that point the SQL data source might be useful for you, especially if you can set up a central SQL server that all of the tests can get to. Another option, if you like the SQL format but want to have something that's portable and moves around with your project and gets checked into source control, would be to use an Access database, so that you could set up an MDB file, drop that into your project, and then use it. I have not been successful using the new SQL Compact Editions database for this purpose. That's something that may work in the future, but at the time that I'm recording this particular module, I've not been able to get that to work. We'll see more about how data mining can be used with these web performance tests in a later module showing how we use it in the context of a load test. That's where this particular application really shines, is when you combine it with load testing. Look for more on this topic once we get to that particular module.